The Arizona Territory in 1883 was a place that didn't care about your secrets. It was a furnace that burned away lies until only the hard, ugly truth remained, usually next to a pile of sun-bleached bones. This land didn't care if you were a good person or a bad one. It only cared if you were strong enough to see the next sunrise. And out there, squatting in the long shadow of the Dragoon Mountains, a lone woman was fighting a war no one would ever see. A war for her life, for the life of the child growing heavy in her belly, and for the life of a strange little boy whose people were on their way to kill her. Her name was Zara O'Connell, and she was staring into the hungry yellow eyes of the wilderness itself. She was armed with a splintered shovel handle and a will forged in pure iron. The sun was a cruel god, a blistering copper coin sinking behind the jagged teeth of the mountains. It bled orange and purple across the sky, painting the beautiful, deadly desert in colors of farewell. For Zara, dusk was the only moment of peace she ever got. It was a cool breath after a day spent suffocating in the heat. Her cabin, a sad little thing made of sun-scorched wood and caked mud, sat alone in a shallow basin. It wasn't much of a home, but it was a fortress. It was hers and the unborn child's, a constant, rolling reminder of the man she'd fled from. A man she prayed was 1,000 miles and a lifetime away. She was outside, her back screaming with a dull, familiar ache, trying to hang a patched sheet on a frayed rope line. Her hands were chapped raw, moving with a practiced slowness that couldn't hide the exhaustion carved into her face. She was only 26, but the desert had been a harsh sculptor, chiseling away her youth, leaving behind sharp angles and a deep weariness in her pale blue eyes. 7 months. 7 months pregnant, 7 months of solitude, and 7 months of a gnawing fear that was louder than the coyotes that yipped and howled in the night. And that's when she heard it. It wasn't the usual sound of the desert. It wasn't the wind or the skittering of a lizard or the cry of a hawk. This was something else, thin, sharp, and piercing. It was the cry of a child. Zara froze, her hands still clutching the damp sheet. She tilted her head, listening, her heart beginning a frantic, heavy drum against her ribs. The sound came again, a desperate, terrified wail that was almost immediately swallowed by a chorus of snarling. Every survival instinct she had screamed at her to go inside, bolt the door, and grab the Winchester rifle that was her only real companion. She was a lone woman, pregnant and vulnerable. This wasn't her fight. The desert had its own brutal laws, and sentiment was a currency that bought you nothing but a quicker grave. But that cry, it tore right through her. It was the sound of pure terror, the sound of a small thing about to be ended by a big one. It was a sound she understood in her very bones. "Damn it all to hell," she whispered, her voice raspy. She let the sheet fall into the dust. Her eyes scanned the landscape. The cries were coming from a rocky outcrop about 200 yards away, a jumble of red sandstone and scrub brush. She could see movement, a frantic, swirling knot of gray and brown bodies. The pack. They had something cornered. Without a second thought, she grabbed the only weapon she had besides her rifle, a shovel. The wooden handle was smooth from use, the iron spade sharp at the edges. It felt heavy and useless in her hands, but it was something. She moved faster than she thought possible, her pregnant body a clumsy, protesting burden. She didn't run, but strode with a long, ground-eating gait, her boots kicking up puffs of red dust. The baby shifted inside her, a painful, lurching protest. But she gritted her teeth and pushed onward, her focus narrowing to the snarling and the now weaker cries. As she got closer, the scene resolved into a living nightmare. A small boy, no older than 5 or 6, was pressed back against a rock face. He was Navajo, his dark hair cut straight across his brow, his simple buckskin tunic torn at the shoulder. His face was a mask of dirt and tears, his small fist clenched. He had a rock in one hand, but his arm was trembling too much to throw it. Circling him were 5 coyotes, and these weren't the scrawny scavengers she sometimes saw. This was a pack, lean and desperate, emboldened by hunger and the fading light. Their ribs showed through their dusty fur, their lips were pulled back in silent snarls, and their yellow eyes glowed with predatory fire. One of them, the leader, a big male with a notched ear, lunged, snapping its jaws inches from the boy's leg. The boy screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure fear. That scream lit a fuse in Zara. "Get away from him!" she roared, her voice cracking with the effort. The coyotes turned as one, surprised by the new arrival. Their attention shifted to her, their snarls now audible, low rumbles of warning. The leader took a step forward, sizing her up. It saw a lone female, strangely shaped, making a threatening noise. It saw an easier meal than the one it had cornered. Zara didn't hesitate. She swung the shovel like a club, the heavy spade whistling through the air. She didn't aim for the leader. She slammed the flat of the spade onto the hard-packed earth just in front of it. The impact sent a shockwave up her arms and a cloud of dust and pebbles into the coyote's face. The animal yelped and jumped back, shaking its head. The others faltered, their pack confidence momentarily broken. "Get back!" Zara screamed again, taking a step forward, putting herself between the boy and the pack. She brandished the shovel, her eyes wild, her fear transmuted into a white-hot rage. She was a mother protecting a child. It didn't matter that he wasn't hers. In that moment, he was. The notched ear male, recovering its nerve, began to circle her. Another darted in from the side. They were testing her, looking for an opening. Zara kept turning, her heavy body making the movement a dizzying, exhausting effort. A coyote lunged for her flank. She twisted and brought the edge of the spade down hard. It connected with the animal's shoulder with a sickening thud. The coyote shrieked and scrambled away, dragging a leg. That was all it took. The attack, the scent of their own blood, the unexpected ferocity of this strange female. It was too much. The leader gave a sharp bark, and as one, the remaining animals melted back into the twilight. The silence that followed was deafening. Zara stood panting, her lungs burning, her whole body trembling with adrenaline. The shovel felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. A small sound made her look up. The boy was still pressed against the rock, his dark eyes wide, watching her. The tears had stopped, replaced by a look of stunned awe. He was bleeding from a gash on his forearm where one of the coyotes had managed to scratch him. Slowly, carefully, Zara lowered the shovel. She held up her empty hands, palms forward. "It's okay," she said, her voice soft now. "You're safe. They're gone." The boy didn't move. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, taking a slow step closer. "You're hurt. Let me see." She gestured to his arm. He flinched. Zara knew she couldn't leave him here, but she also knew that taking a Navajo child, even to help him, was a risk that could get her killed. Relations between settlers and the tribes were a frayed rope over a deep canyon, ready to snap. But looking at his small, trembling form, she knew there was no choice. She knelt, a difficult and painful maneuver, and set the shovel aside. "Come on now," she coaxed. "My cabin is just over there. It's warm. I have water." After a long, tense moment, he gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. She rose stiffly and offered him her hand. He hesitated, then his small, dirt-caked fingers slipped into hers. As they walked toward the lonely light beginning to glow in her cabin window, Zara felt a new kind of fear settle over her. It was one thing to fight off a pack of wild animals. It was another thing entirely to face the judgment of men. Dusk was falling, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the boys' tribe would be coming, and they wouldn't be coming to talk. The inside of the cabin was a small pocket of order in a world of chaos. A single kerosene lamp cast a warm, golden glow. To Zara, it was a sanctuary. To the boy, it was clearly a cage. He stood just inside the door, poised to bolt, his eyes darting around the unfamiliar room. Zara closed the door, the solid thud of the bolt sliding home, sounding like the slamming of a prison cell. She saw him flinch. "It's all right," she said softly, "just keeping the night out." "First, the wound." She gestured for him to sit at the table. He obeyed, perching on the very edge of the chair. Zara stoked the embers in the hearth, put a pot of water on a warm, and took out a clean strip of linen and a small bottle of carbolic acid. "This might sting a little," she warned, dipping a corner of the linen. When she reached for his arm, he pulled back instinctively. Zara paused. She looked into his eyes, dark and deep as a desert night. She tried to pour every ounce of reassurance she could muster into her gaze. Clean, she said, pointing to her own arm. Make better. He seemed to understand. Slowly, reluctantly, he extended his arm. The gash was shallow but angry and red. Zara worked with gentle efficiency. The boy hissed in pain when the acid touched his raw flesh, but didn't pull away. He bit his lip, and a single tear traced a clean path through the dirt on his cheek. When she was done, she wrapped the arm snugly with the linen bandage. He looked at his bandaged arm, then up at her. For the first time, the terror in his eyes was replaced by something else. Curiosity, maybe even a flicker of trust. "What's your name?" she asked, knowing he wouldn't understand. She pointed to herself. "Zara." Then she pointed to him. He stared at her blankly. Of course he would say nothing. He was Navajo, the Dene. They had deep-seated reasons to be wary of sharing anything with a white person. As she turned to the hearth to make some cornmeal gruel, the reality of her situation crashed down on her again. She had a Navajo child in her cabin, a child who was missing, a family that was, right now, almost certainly searching for him. A search party of Navajo warriors was not something any settler wanted to encounter. Her hand went to her belly. It wasn't just her own life she had to worry about. She had gambled everything to give this child a life free from its father, Silas Kane, a man with cold eyes and a fist as quick as his temper. Escaping him had been the hardest thing she'd ever done. A sound from outside cut through her thoughts. It wasn't coyotes this time. It was the rhythmic, unmistakable thud of unshod ponies' hooves on hard earth. Many of them. Zara's blood ran cold. The boy heard it too. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. He slid off the chair and ran to the cabin's single small window. Zara rushed to his side, peering cautiously over his head. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. On the ridge that overlooked her basin, silhouetted against the last deep purple of the twilight sky, were riders. A dozen of them, maybe more. They sat motionless on their ponies, their forms stark and menacing. They were not cowboys. The long lines of their rifles, the feathers just visible in their hair. They were warriors. Navajo. They weren't charging. They were just watching the cabin, watching her. It was a silent, terrifying judgment. The boy beside her pressed his face against the glass. He whispered a word in his own tongue, his voice full of awe. He was pointing to the lead rider. The man sat slightly ahead of the others, a figure of commanding presence. He was bigger than the rest, and even from this distance, Zara could feel the intensity of his stillness. This had to be the leader, a war chief, or a father, maybe both. Zara pulled the boy back from the window. "Don't let them see you," she whispered, her voice trembling. But it was too late. They knew he was in here. They must have tracked him right to her door. What would they think? They would find a lone white woman with their missing child, who was now bandaged. The conclusion was obvious and damning. She had taken him, kidnapped him, hurt him. She was trapped. If she went out, she faced them alone. If she stayed inside, she was a coward, hiding, confirming their worst suspicions. The men on the ridge did not move. They were patient. They had all the time in the world. Zara looked at the Winchester leaning in the corner. It would be suicide. No, there was only one path. She had acted to save the boy. She had to trust that the truth, however fragile, was stronger than their assumptions. She took a deep, shuddering breath. "All right," she said to herself. She looked at the child, who was now looking up at her, his fear mirroring her own. She smoothed his hair, a gesture that was as much to steady her own hand as to comfort him. Then she turned toward the door. She would face them. She would face the man the boy seemed to call an eagle, and pray he had some measure of justice in his heart. She reached for the bolt, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grasp it. With a final whispered prayer, she slid it back. The sound was a thunderclap in the suffocating silence. Opening the door was like breaking the surface of water after holding your breath for too long. The night air, cool and smelling of dust and sage, rushed in. Zara stepped out onto the hard-packed earth, leaving the boy inside but in plain sight. She held her hands open and empty at her sides, a universal sign of peace she prayed they would recognize. The riders on the ridge had not moved, statues carved from the night. But now as she stood in the open, the lead rider urged his pony forward. He descended the shallow slope with a steady, deliberate pace. Two other riders followed, fanning out to his sides, their rifles held ready. The rest remained on the ridge, a silent jury. As the man drew closer, the lamplight from the cabin door spilled across him. He was formidable. His face was a mask of hard lines and high cheekbones, framed by long, dark hair bound with a leather strap. His eyes, fixed on her, were dark and piercing, missing nothing. He radiated a coiled intensity, a dangerous stillness that was far more intimidating than any overt threat. He reined his pony to a halt about 20 feet from her. His two companions stopped a little further back, creating a closing triangle with her at the point. The silence was absolute. The man's eyes flicked from her face, down to her swollen belly, then to the open cabin door, where the boy stood half hidden. The man's expression hardened. A muscle jumped in his jaw. He spoke, his voice deep, rough, and uncompromising. The words were in the Diné language, guttural and sharp. She didn't understand them, but the meaning was clear. It was an accusation, a demand. "What have you done?" Zara swallowed, her throat as dry as sand. "I don't understand," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I mean no harm. The boy, he was attacked. Coyotes." She gestured toward the rocky outcrop, then made a snapping motion with her hands, trying to mimic jaws. She pointed to the boy's bandaged arm. "Coyotes," she repeated. "I helped him." The man's gaze remained cold, unmoved. His son was missing. He finds him in the cabin of a lone Bilagana, an Anglo. The boy's injured. The woman is frightened. Guilt, he knew, made people frightened. He spoke again, a short, sharp command. But it wasn't directed at her. From inside the cabin, the boy, Haston, ran from the doorway. He didn't run to Zara. He ran straight to the lead rider, his father. He reached the pony and threw his arms around the man's leg, burying his face in the leather. The formidable warrior's stony expression broke for just a second. A wave of profound relief washed over his features as he looked down at his son. He reached down and rested a hand on the boy's head, a gesture of infinite gentleness. His name, she would later learn, was Ashki, and he was not just a father. He was a war chief, renowned for his ferocity in protecting his people. After reassuring himself the boy was whole, Ashki's hard mass slipped back into place. He dismounted in a single fluid motion. He knelt and spoke to his son in low, soft tones. The boy answered, his voice small, pointing a trembling finger first at his bandaged arm, then at Zara, then back toward the rocks. As Ashki listened, his eyes remained fixed on Zara. She could see the conflict in them. The story his son was telling must have been a confusing one. He stood up, his gaze sweeping over her again, lingering on the shovel that now lay near the door. The weapon. Before he could speak, another figure descended from the ridge. Not a warrior, but an old woman. Her face was a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles. She walked with a stiff grace, leaning on a sturdy stick. Her expression was not hostile, but one of deep, penetrating wisdom. She walked past Ashki and went straight to the boy. She knelt, her old joints creaking, and spoke to him with a grandmother's tenderness. This was Shimasani, Ashki's mother, a respected elder. The boy, who had been timid with his powerful father, opened up to her, a torrent of words and gestures pouring out of him. Shimasani listened patiently, her dark, intelligent eyes occasionally flicking toward Zara. When the boy was finished, she gently took his arm and began to unwrap the linen bandage. Ashki watched, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. Zara's heart pounded. This was the moment of truth. Shimasani examined the gash, her wrinkled fingers probing gently. She sniffed it, then looked closely at the clean linen. She looked up, past Ashki, and her eyes met Zara's. For the first time, Zara felt she was being truly seen, not as a white woman or a threat, but as a person. The old woman's gaze held no malice, only a deep, thoughtful evaluation. She looked at Ashki and spoke in their tongue. Her voice was calm and measured. He listened, his stony expression unchanging, but Zara saw the tension in his shoulders ease fractionally. Then Shimasani did something that changed everything. She rewrapped the boy's arm using the very same linen strip Zara had provided. It was a small gesture, but it was a monumental one, an acceptance, an acquittal. Shimasani rose and walked toward Zara. She stopped a few feet away and simply looked at her, her eyes taking in Zara's exhaustion, her frayed dress, the protective hand that rested instinctively on her belly. The old woman's gaze softened with something that looked like empathy. She gave a slow, deliberate nod, a nod of thanks, of respect. But Ashki was still conflicted. His duty and his instincts were at war. This woman had saved his son, but she was still an outsider, a potential danger. He barked an order. One of his men dismounted and came forward. Ashki lifted his son and placed him on the pony's back. He then issued a series of commands. They were to make a cold camp here in the basin. They would not leave. Not yet. He turned back to Zara, his shadow falling over her. He pointed a finger at her, then at the ground, then drew a circle in the air around the cabin. The message was clear. You will stay here. She was no longer a suspected kidnapper, but she was now a person of interest. And until they understood her, she was a prisoner in her own home. Ashki mounted his pony, his son held securely in front of him. With one last, long, unreadable look at Zara, he turned and rode to where his men were setting up camp, a ring of silent watchers around her tiny, vulnerable cabin. Zara retreated back inside, bolting the door. She slumped against it, her legs finally giving way, and slid to the floor. She wrapped her arms around her belly, around her child, and for the first time since she'd fled Texas, she wept. She had survived the coyotes and the confrontation, but the night was long, and she was surrounded by a people whose trust she had not yet earned. The true danger, she feared, had only just begun. The night was an exercise in listening. Every soft stamp of a pony's hoof, every low murmur in the Diné tongue from the camp outside, was magnified in the silence of the cabin. Sleep would not come. Her mind raced, replaying the confrontation, trying to decipher the expressions on Ashki's face. The baby in her womb was restless, tumbling and kicking, as if sensing its mother's distress. Dawn brought no relief, only a clearer view of her captors. They were disciplined, a military unit. Around mid-morning, Zara saw Ashki in a heated discussion with two of his scouts. They gestured emphatically to the south, their faces grim. Ashki's own face grew darker with every word. Something was wrong, something beyond her. A short time later, Shimasani appeared at her door. She was alone. Taking a breath, Zara unbolted the door. The old woman held out a small, tightly woven basket. Inside were 2 pieces of fry bread and a strip of roasted venison. It was a peace offering, a payment. Zara's pride bristled, but her hunger was sharper. Thank you, she said, taking the basket. To Zara's surprise, Shimasani gestured toward the inside of the cabin. She wanted to enter. Hesitantly, Zara stepped aside. They both sat at the small table, a pregnant white settler and a Navajo elder, separated by a gulf of language and culture. After a long moment of silence, Shimasani began to speak. She used a combination of her own language, hand gestures, and a few surprisingly clear English words. She pointed to her grandson, Hastian, who was visible in the camp. He see bad men, she said, her voice a low rasp. Our water, they stop it. She made a damning motion with her hands, piling imaginary rocks. Steal it. Zara's blood ran cold. In this arid land, water was life. To steal it was to issue a death sentence. Hasten, he saw them, the old woman continued, her voice growing harder. The men, they chase him. She made a running motion with her fingers. He run long. Coyotes find him. Suddenly, it all made a terrible, sickening sense. The boy hadn't just wandered off. He had been fleeing for his life. He had stumbled upon something he wasn't meant to see. Who were these men? Zara asked, leaning forward. Shimasani shook her head. No, but one man. She held up her hand, mimicking a pistol. Then she pointed to the pistol's handle. Shiny, she said, like silver star. She then drew a shape in the air with her finger, a letter S intertwined with a looping serpent. Zara felt the air leave her lungs. The world tilted, the small cabin spinning around her. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She knew that mark. She knew it better than she knew her own reflection. It was a brand seared not only onto thousands of heads of cattle, but onto her own memory, a symbol of power, greed, and terrifying cruelty. The silver inlaid pistol, the serpentine S brand. There was only one man in this territory who used that mark. Silas Kane, she whispered, the name tasting like poison on her tongue. Shimasani's sharp eyes narrowed. The way Zara said the name, not as a question, but as a curse, a recognition, was unmistakable. "You know this man?" she asked, her English suddenly more focused. Zara's carefully constructed walls of solitude and secrecy came crashing down. Her past, the monster she had run 1,000 miles to escape, had found her. It had reached out its long arm and entangled itself with the lives of these people, the family of the very boy she had saved. There was no running now. There was no hiding. Tears welled in her eyes. Tears of fear, of rage, of utter, hopeless despair. "Know him," she said, her voice a ragged, broken thing. "He is my husband." The silence that followed was absolute. Shimasani stared at her, the revelation settling in her ancient eyes, connecting dots Zara couldn't even see. The strange, pregnant white woman alone in the wilderness. The powerful man stealing their water. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a convergence. Shimasani stood up. Her face was grim, etched with a new and profound understanding. She looked at Zara's belly. "His child?" she asked, her voice soft but heavy. Zara could only nod, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. Without another word, the old woman turned and left the cabin. Zara watched her go, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She had just handed them a weapon, her connection to their greatest enemy. They could use it against her. They could see her as a spy, a Confederate. They could kill her, and no one would ever know or care. She waited for the cry of alarm, for the warriors to descend on her cabin. But nothing happened. Instead, she saw Shimasani walk directly to her son, Ashki. She spoke to him, her voice low and urgent. Zara watched as Ashki's body went rigid. He turned and stared at the cabin, his face a thundercloud of disbelief and fury. He stared for a long, terrible minute. Zara felt his gaze like a physical blow, even through the wooden walls. She saw him clench his fists. He took a step toward her cabin, and her blood turned to ice. But then he stopped. He looked from her cabin to his son, Haston, who was watching him with wide, fearful eyes. He looked at his mother, who stood her ground, her expression implacable. The war chief, the father, the son, all three parts of him were at war. Finally, he turned his back on the cabin and strode to the edge of the camp, staring out at the southern horizon, toward the stolen water, toward the land of the man named Silas Kane. Zara didn't know if she had just signed her own death warrant or forged the most unlikely and dangerous alliance of her life. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on the small cabin, and for the first time, the heat outside was no match for the firestorm of terror and uncertainty raging within her. The name had been spoken, and now the rattlesnake was coiled to strike. The rest of the day passed in a state of suspended animation. The fragile truce built on the rescue of a child had been shattered by the speaking of a name, Silas Kane. The Navajo warriors now looked at Zara with open hostility. She was the wife of their enemy, carrying his blood. In their eyes, she was a contamination, a potential traitor in their midst. She saw one warrior spit on the ground in her direction, a gesture of pure contempt. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her gut. She had escaped Silas's cage, only to find herself in another, this one ringed by men who had every reason to kill her. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, Ashki finally moved. He called his senior warriors and his mother to him. They formed a tight circle near their fire. Though Zara couldn't hear their words, she could read the violent debate in their gestures. Arms were thrown out, pointing toward her cabin. Fists were clenched. This was her trial, and she was not there to speak in her own defense. She watched as Ashki listened, his face a stone carving in the flickering firelight, weighing the anger of his men against the quiet counsel of his mother. The counsel broke. Zara's heart hammered against her ribs as two figures detached from the group and walked toward her cabin. Ashki and Shimasani. This was it. The verdict. She met them at the door, her chin held high, determined to conceal the fear that threatened to paralyze her. Ashki's face was stone, but his eyes burned with a cold, interrogating fire. My mother tells me you fled this man, Cain, Ashki said. His English was clear, though spoken with deliberation, as if each word was a carefully chosen stone. She says you fear him. Fear is too small a word, Zara replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her soul. I ran to save my life, and the life of my child. She instinctively placed a hand over her belly. Ashki's eyes narrowed, searching her face for the hint of deception he was sure must be there. Why should we believe the wife of a liar and a thief? He demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Because his child grows inside me, Zara said, meeting his gaze without flinching. This is the only thing of his I could not leave behind. I will protect this baby from his poison, just as you want to protect your son, your water, and your people from him. She took a breath, laying her only card on the table. We have a common enemy, Ashki. That is a truth more powerful than any marriage vow, or my white skin. Her words hung in the cool night air. She had laid her soul bare, offering him the one piece of common ground they shared, a deep and abiding hatred for Silas Cain. Shimasani spoke to her son in their tongue, her voice firm and persuasive. Ashki was silent for a long moment, the war inside him playing out across his face. Finally he spoke. This man Cain, he said, you know his ways. I know his strengths and his weaknesses, Zara added quickly. He is arrogant. He underestimates anyone who isn't rich and white. He believes his money can buy him anything he wants. He will not expect you to be organized, and he will not expect me. As if summoned by her words, a scout ran into the camp from the darkness, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He spoke in urgent, sharp Navajo. Ashki listened, and his entire demeanor changed. The strategic debate was over. The immediate threat had arrived. He comes, Ashki said, turning back to Zara, his voice now stripped of all doubt, replaced by grim certainty. 3 riders. They are not coming for the water, they are coming for the witness. He glanced toward his son, who was kept safely by the fire, and for the runaway. He looked directly at her. Silas knew. He had put the pieces together. The 2 loose ends of his brutal world, his fugitive wife and the witness to his crimes, were in the same place. He wouldn't come to talk. He would come to erase them. They ride for this cabin, Ashki stated. In that instant, everything shifted. Zara was no longer a prisoner. She was an asset. The cabin was no longer her jail. It was a fortress. The men outside were no longer her captors. They were her only line of defense. Ashki turned and shouted orders. The camp exploded into silent, purposeful action. Warriors faded into the darkness, taking up positions behind rocks and in dry gullies. Bows were strung. Rifles were checked. You will stay inside, Ashki commanded Zara. Stay down, away from the door and the window. No, Zara said, surprising herself as much as him. The fear was still there, but it had been forged into something hard and sharp. This is my fight too. He's coming for me. I know this cabin. I know him. She looked at the Winchester rifle leaning by the door. And I know how to use one of these. Ashki stared at her, a new respect dawning in his eyes. He saw not a frightened white woman, but a fellow warrior, backed into a corner and ready to fight for her young. He gave a sharp nod. The lamp makes you a target. Zara immediately moved and extinguished the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness. She grabbed the Winchester, the cool metal a reassuring weight. She moved to the side of the window, pressing her back against the wall. Outside there was only silence. The warriors had vanished. The waiting began. The silence stretched taut with impending violence. Then she heard it. A faint clink of iron on stone far out, but getting closer. The sound of shod horses. The siege of the lonely cabin in the Dragoon Mountains had begun. The riders appeared as phantoms in the pale starlight. 3 dark shapes moving with a confident arrogance that grated on the tense silence. They were not trying to be quiet. They believed they were hunting a single, terrified woman. Zara recognized the lead rider immediately, even as a silhouette. The way he sat his horse, straight-backed and proprietary, as if he owned the very ground beneath him. Silas Cain. Zara! His voice boomed across the basin, a whip crack of condescending authority. Send out the little savage, and I'll make your end quick. It's the only mercy you'll get from me." The threat was a calculated cruelty designed to shatter her will. It did the opposite. It fueled the fire in Zara's veins to an inferno. She gripped the Winchester, the stock pressed hard against her shoulder, her cold fury a perfect match for the cold metal. She sighted down the barrel, waiting. "Now, Ashki," she whispered, a prayer to the man outside. As if hearing her, the night answered with a soft, deadly hiss. An arrow flew from the darkness to the left, a whisper of death that ended with a sickening thunk. The rider to Silas's left, a man Zara knew as Tanner, grunted a sound of pure surprise and toppled sideways from his saddle like a sack of grain. All hell broke loose. The big man on Silas's right roared and opened fire with his repeating rifle, spraying bullets wildly into the darkness. Sparks flew as rounds ricocheted off the rocks. Silas cursed and dove from his horse, taking cover behind the panicked animal. A rifle shot cracked from the right. Ashki. And the second man's horse screamed, collapsing and trapping the big man's leg beneath it. From her vantage point, Zara saw her chance. While Silas and his man were pinned by the fire from the hidden warriors, they weren't paying attention to the cabin. They still thought she was a helpless victim, cowering inside. She aimed carefully, not at Silas, but at the trapped and flailing man. She squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against her shoulder, the explosion deafening in the enclosed space. Her shot went wide, kicking up dust near the man's head, but it had achieved its purpose. "She's armed!" the man shrieked, his voice laced with panic. "The bitch is armed!" The knowledge that the cabin itself was hostile threw them into disarray. Another arrow, swift and silent, flew from the shadows and buried itself in the man's throat, silencing his panic for good. Now it was just Silas. He was pinned, alone, and for the first time in his life, not in control. He was a wealthy, powerful man, but out here his money was worthless. He was just one man with a pistol against an unseen, lethal enemy. So he did the one thing Zara knew he would. He abandoned any thought of a standoff and made a desperate, arrogant rush for the source of his problem, the cabin. He broke from cover, firing his silver-inlaid pistol wildly toward the rocks, running in a low crouch directly for the door. He still believed he could intimidate her, bend her to his will through sheer force. "Zara!" Ashki shouted, a warning. But Zara was ready. This was her ground. As Silas charged through the doorway, a dark, raging bull of a man, she was not where he expected her to be. She had moved away from the window and was standing in the deepest shadows near the hearth. He burst in, pistol raised, his eyes trying to adjust to the gloom. "Zara, you treacherous, I'll gut you for this." His words were cut short as she swung the heavy, cast-iron skillet she'd taken from the hearth. She put all her weight, all her fear, and all her rage into the blow. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening crack, the sound of metal hitting bone. Silas staggered, a look of utter shock on his face. The silver-inlaid pistol clattered to the floor. He wasn't used to being fought back against. He wasn't used to pain. He reached for his head, his fingers coming away wet with blood. He stared at her, his eyes full of disbelief and a dawning animal fear. "You?" he breathed, unable to comprehend the defiance. Before he could recover, Ashki was there, filling the doorway. He held not his rifle, but the large hunting knife from his belt. His face was implacable, the face of a man executing a just sentence. This was no longer just about Zara. This was about the stolen water. This was about his terrorized child. This was a reckoning. Silas saw him, and his arrogance returned in a final, foolish act of defiance. He lunged not for Zara, but for Ashki, his hands like claws. The fight was short, brutal, and primal. Ashki moved with the grace of a panther, sidestepping Silas's clumsy charge. The knife flashed once, a silver arc in the gloom. Silas Kane stopped, his body going rigid. He looked down at the handle of Ashki's knife protruding from his chest. He looked up at Zara, his eyes wide with the ultimate surprise. He opened his mouth, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. Then he collapsed to the floor of the cabin, and the dust rose up around him. The silence that descended was profound. The battle was over. Ashki stood over the body of his enemy, his chest heaving. He pulled his knife free and wiped it clean on Silas's own shirt. He looked at Zara, at the skillet still clutched in her hand, at the fierce, protective fire still burning in her eyes. He gave her a single sharp nod. It was a nod of respect, of alliance, of a debt paid in blood. The sun rose on a changed world. The bodies were gone, removed by the quiet efficiency of the warriors. Ashki approached Zara as she stood by her door, watching the dawn paint the sky. Shimasani was with him. "He will not trouble you again," Ashki said simply. "His name will fade from this land." "Thank you," Zara said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "It is we who thank you," Ashki corrected her. "You saved my son. You fought as a warrior. Our debt is paid, but our respect remains." He paused, his expression growing serious. "You cannot stay here. Others from his world will come. They will ask questions." Zara knew he was right. Her solitude was broken forever. "I know," she said, her heart heavy. "I don't know where to go." "You will not go alone," Shimasani said, stepping forward. The old woman pressed a small deerskin pouch into Zara's hand. It was heavy with jerky and dried corn for her journey. She then placed a hand on Zara's belly and murmured a blessing in the Diné language, a soft prayer for the child's safe arrival and a strong life. Haston, the little boy who had started it all, came forward shyly. He pushed a small object into her other hand. It was a piece of smooth wood, crudely carved into the shape of a coyote, its teeth and ferocity rendered harmless in soft pine. A memory, a charm. Ashki gestured to two of his warriors who were loading Zara's few possessions onto a gentle pony. "We will guide you 2 days west," he said, "to the trail that leads to California. A new land, a place to begin again." Tears filled Zara's eyes, but this time they were not tears of fear. They were tears of profound gratitude. An hour later, she rode away from the lonely cabin, flanked by Navajo warriors. She was no longer a fugitive running from her past, but a survivor riding toward a future. She glanced back one last time at the basin that had almost claimed her, and then turned her face to the west, toward the promise of a new dawn for her and the child she carried. The desert had not swallowed her, it had forged her. The story of Zara O'Connell isn't one you'll find in the history books. It's a testament to the quiet, desperate courage that truly settled the West, not with land grabs and railroads, but with moments of profound, unexpected humanity. It's a reminder that alliances can be forged in the most hostile of lands, and that the fiercest warriors are often those defending their young, whether they be a war chief protecting his tribe or a pregnant mother standing against the darkness. This tale shows us that even in a place defined by its brutality, a single act of compassion can change the course of lives, proving that our shared humanity is the most valuable territory we can ever hope to defend. If this story of grit, survival, and unlikely friendship moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who loves a powerful tale. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next story from the forgotten corners of history.